say a huge thank you for having me on Just Another Poet, and also to everybody who's watched and listened to this. It's been a real joy to have done this today, and it's also been really nice for me to watch all of the other interviews from the other poets. It's great to learn more about people's processes, their creativity, their inspiration. So for those of you listening here, if you haven't seen some of the other interviews, definitely go check them out. There's some really wonderful ones, and subscribe to the channel. It's a nice way for us to build our poetic community, and I'm just really pleased to be a part of it. So thank you so much for having me and for listening, and I hope all of you have a really inspiring and lovely day. Well, yes, my interest in writing both poetry and fiction started when I was quite young. Originally, I wrote as a child to kind of escape the things that were going on in my house. So I grew up in an environment where there was a lot of poverty and domestic violence and drugs. So writing short stories or writing really terrible poetry gave me sort of an opportunity to escape or flee from what was going on in my house. I also kept kind of a loose diary journal where I was sort of documenting some of the things that were going on and just trying to work through them and understand them, and I suppose get like some therapeutic benefit, although as a child I probably didn't realize that. I think things changed a bit when I knew that I wanted to do writing, not more professionally, but I guess engage in it more seriously when I was still quite young, about 10 years old, and I wrote a paragraph, a descriptive paragraph, that was the assignment for my English literature teacher, about one of my Briar horse figurines. So I wrote this descriptive paragraph. I spent a lot of time observing the horse and looking at all of its different colors and the shading and imperfections, and I wrote this paragraph which was really full of love for this figurine, and the teacher really loved it, and she wanted to publish it in the school newspaper, and I was so shocked. And I kind of suddenly realized that this thing that I enjoyed doing in my room alone, and that was giving me some solace and some escape from my difficult family life, could also impact people, could also make someone else happy. So my teacher was really excited about this piece, and I suddenly realized that writing didn't have to be this like alone, secret, private thing, that actually it could positively impact other people. And from then on, I sort of started to develop my feelings about writing as being communal. So it's really about the relationship between the writer and the reader, and this idea that I might be able to write something that could have a positive impact on people was really exciting. Not just because it makes you feel good, of course, like when someone praises your work or when she was excited about my work, it made me feel good, but also that writing had the power to like make change and make someone's day and make them think differently about something. That was a revelation for me at that young age. So yeah, it started as a young child, and my love has continued into my adulthood, which I'm really grateful for. This is a great question. And in fact, Sydney Whiteside just published a Writing Across Continents feature on the Wales Arts Review, which looks at my collection and Zoe Brigley's collection of nonfiction essays. And it's all about this, about writing between America and Wales and what that means. I think for me, living between America and Wales, so living on both places, has affected my writing in, I guess, two key ways. The first is that moving away from America has really given me a sense of objectivity. So it's really let me assess and think about the place where I grew up, my education, and America as a country in a global space very differently to the way that I would have thought about it had I only lived there and not lived abroad. So that has been a really valuable thing, that distance and that objectivity, when I come to write about America and my upbringing there. And then, of course, the opposite is true of Wales. I mean, I didn't really know a lot about Wales when I moved here. I knew very little. I was very excited about Welsh cakes and the beautiful landscapes, but I didn't really know a lot about the history, about the culture, about the language, about the politics. And I've lived here for a decade now, so I have a much more in-depth and nuanced understanding of what it means to live in Wales and to be somebody who is not necessarily a Welsh person, but someone who comes here and claims Wales as their home. So for me, that objectivity and distance that I was able to gain from the US when I moved away, and the sort of deeper relationship that I've been able to gain from Wales, has impacted my writing hugely. It has affected the way I write about both places. The other thing that's, I think, really interesting about living between these two places is the kind of poetry education that I had. So when I was growing up in the States, my education there meant that I was really studying mostly American poets, and any of the British poets that I was able to look at in school and at university were not really contemporary. I would say the newest poets that I was able to study were the Romantics. So the English, Wordsworth and Keats. So I didn't really have access to contemporary poets. And because I was quite poor and grew up in a poor family and was kind of struggling to make my way through university, I was working a lot. So I would be in university mostly from 8 to 5 every day. And then I would go from 6 to 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock and work in my retail job. So I wasn't really being able to access any contemporary writing events. I didn't get to meet other writers. I was studying English literature. So although people loved writing, a lot of them weren't doing it on their own. They were mainly interested in the sort of reading side of things. So I had a very limited actual education in contemporary writing in the US. But when I moved to Britain and I moved to Wales to study creative writing at a master's level, suddenly the world just opened. I was able to really immerse myself in the Welsh poetry scene. I was able to travel to see contemporary poets, and suddenly I realized all the kinds of things that were being written, and that transformed my writing hugely. So actually, as a poet, my experience of being immersed within the Welsh and the wider British, English, Scottish, Irish poetry scene has been hugely influential and transformative for my writing. And I think that that is the thing that has really influenced me the most. So now I'm often called a British writer, even though I'm from America. My influences are often based here because it's where I can spend time with, learn from contemporary writers today. Yes, I'm really happy to talk about my PhD research. I do feel like I could talk about this forever, so I'm gonna try and just give you the highlights. So with other creative writing PhDs, mine was quite similar. So it had a creative component and a critical component. The creative component for me was a poetry collection, this collection called More Than You Were. This collection explores my dad's death. He died of a drug overdose, and honestly, it was such a difficult experience to understand and interpret and to manage. So it was a very complex relationship because of his drug addiction. So writing this collection was an important part of that PhD, and reflecting on it, trying to understand what it meant and what these kind of poetic choices meant when it came to discussing the death of a drug addict. The second part of the PhD is the critical kind of component. And for me, I was looking at what it meant to lose someone to drug addiction, what it meant to have your grief disenfranchised, so not publicly acknowledged or socially accepted. And I did that by exploring lots of different ideas around grief, mourning, trauma. And then I also had a qualitative study. So I actually interviewed and met with people who experienced bereavement by addiction. So we met together, we had interviews, I talked to them about their experience. I gave them 4 weeks to do writing. I had 10 prompts, and then I came back and I interviewed them about their experience. So I'm hoping to publish a couple of the results and conclusions in some journals soon. So definitely keep an eye out for that if you're interested. The final part of my critical component also looked at how poetry could represent disenfranchised grief and what that meant. There are not actually a lot of poetry collections out there about losing someone to a drug addiction. So I was focusing on people whose relationships were disenfranchised or problematic. So I looked at a couple of collections I'll show you now, which I really recommend. This one's called The Zoo Father by Pascal Petit. She had a very complicated and abusive relationship with her father who died. So that's what this collection looks at. The second was called Autopsy by Dante Collins. So this collection is about his mother's death, and they also had a complex abusive relationship. So it's a really fascinating collection. And then the third one, it's a little different. It's called I Know Your Kind by William Brewer. So this looks at it's quite an elegiac collection about a town in West Virginia, which has basically been hit by the opioid crisis and by Oxycontin. So there are lots of addicts there. Lots of terrible things have happened to that town. Many people have died. And so this collection explores that in a variety of ways and is a really beautiful collection. And then, of course, I also, like all creative writing PhDs, explored my own collection and reflected on that experience and what I might be able to add to this wider discussion of disenfranchised grief. So this PhD was quite personal to me, and it was very intellectually and emotionally challenging process, but I am so grateful that I had this chance to do it, and I feel very excited to have finished my Viva during lockdown and to now be a doctor. It's really surreal. So I guess if anyone is interested in this research, or if anybody is interested in what it means to write about grief or bereavement, especially by addiction or in other complicated circumstances, please reach out, because I'm always up for talking about this. So yeah, thanks for posing that question. I love these questions on inspiration. I think it's really challenging though, because I feel like I'm a really fickle reader and I always find new inspiration by reading new books. I recently wrote a blog post for the poetry question, which was about the top 5 books which have inspired me or influenced me over the course of my writing life. So I'll give you a link to that and you can read a bit more about those books. There's a mix of poetry and memoir. I think when I think about inspiration now, there are lots of poets that inspire me to do different things. So one of the people I always talk about who inspires me is a British poet called Rebecca Goss. This is her collection, Her Birth. This collection was the first one that I read about grief, which really spoke to me. And the reason it spoke to me was because it was written using very accessible language in an incredibly direct way. So it didn't really use metaphor to shy away from challenge or difficulty. It was put together in a chronological way. There were lots of amazing kind of snapshot moments. And for me, this was a huge inspiration for my first collection and a reminder about the power of accessibility and direct language. So this was hugely inspirational for me at that time with my first collection. I think when I came to write my second collection, it's very difficult to just pin down any type of collection which had the same profound impact on me. I read incredibly widely. I read huge amounts of poetry all the time. So I have recently been doing a My Poetry Bookshelf project. So on Twitter and Instagram with the hashtag My Poetry Bookshelf, you can actually see all of the poets that I'm currently rereading. Many of those are the ones that influenced the writing of my second collection. I've already posted over 100 at the moment, so there's lots of great things about inspiration there. For my very current, this exact moment inspiration, I have been incredibly inspired by this collection. It's called Homie by Denise Smith. So this collection is incredibly powerful. Not only does it push boundaries a bit with form and a bit with the way that poems look on the page, as well as punctuation, but it also explores really challenging subject matter in a way which is very precise and bold. So it looks at racial injustices, difficulties with identity, identity, sexuality. It is an incredibly powerful collection, and I admire it for its bravery and courage, but also for its way of playing with the page and with language. And you can see all the lovely dog ears there. So there's lots of poems in there that I love. So I think inspiration for me, there are these anchored collections, which you can see in that blog post and which you've seen in Rebecca Goss's collection, that I can really put down to building me as a poet. But really for me, inspiration is always changing. So I'm constantly reading new work and constantly being inspired by different approaches to poetry. So this is my most recent source of inspiration, which I would recommend to everyone. I did not imagine that I would be launching a book in lockdown. It has been such a strange experience, but I'm still really grateful that this book is out in the world, and in a way people are starting to take photos of it arriving in their homes, and it's really nice to see those, because I feel like the book is doing the kind of traveling and connecting that I would like to be doing right now, and so it's nice to see the book kind of making its way into people's homes. So this is the collection. It's called How to Carry Fire, and it was published with Parthian Books in April. So really, this collection explores fire in lots of ways, in both literal ways. So it opens with the burning down of my childhood home, but also like figurative and metaphorical ways. So it looks at fire as something that's really destructive and difficult. So I kind of look at family addiction, for instance, and anxiety. But it also looks at fire as something which is really positive. So like the creative process, like passion, like love. And it looks at the cleansing power of fire as well. So what it means to lose everything and rebuild. So there's a lot about homemaking here. There's the first section, which is about growing up in America and my home there. And then the second section, which is mostly placed in Wales. So what it means for me to build a home here, to fall in love. This collection was really interesting to write. So coming from my first collection, More Than You Were, that one had a lot of very rigid rules. So I had put a lot of rules in place for that book. I was trying to write about grief, which was really big and unwieldy and difficult. So I was using only a certain number of lines. I was keeping my stanzas really short, so most of the poems only have 1 or 2 stanzas. I was using mostly monosyllabic words, so really short words. I was using pronouns in a particular way, so I had very rigid like constructs that allowed me to write that first book, because otherwise I don't think I would have been able to manage the bigness and the chaos of my grief. So after that book was published and I started working on this second book, it was really scary. I was writing with complete freedom, and I was writing with the opportunity to experiment and to think and to create new work. And this book went through lots of iterations. At first, it was a water book. It was called How to Build a Boat. And it really looked at the ocean as a metaphor between America and Wales, and what water meant. But about halfway through the collection writing, my brother, who's a heroin addict, he relapsed. And we had had these long, difficult conversations all during the process of his relapsing. And they always came back to this house fire. And I suddenly realized that so much of the root of the change and the challenge that came in my adult life has come from that fire. And that's the same for him and for my mother and my father as well. So it suddenly clicked the collection into place, and I was able to explore and find my confidence again, and to really hone what I wanted this collection to say. So it has been a real joy to write this book. It has been hard, but it has been necessary, and it's been nice to launch the book even in a different circumstance. And there's been this sort of intimacy about the launches and about these readings that are happening online, where here I am talking about home, revealing, challenging, and difficult subjects. And when I'm reading, I'm reading into people's homes, and I can see them in their living rooms on Zoom, kind of silently clapping, and we're kind of entering these intimate spaces together. And that has been a really lovely and unexpected joy of launching this book during lockdown. And I'm excited to see where it takes me. Well, I always have lots of creative projects on the go, but the one I'm really focusing on at the moment is my third poetry collection. So this collection looks a little bit at the women in my family, and it's really about, at the moment, exploring the intersection between women's strength and vulnerability, and also looking at things like domestication and wildness. So I'm doing that in lots of ways. I've got some poems, narrative poems about the women in my family who are often classed as like very strong, you know, emotionally and physically, but who have they themselves been victims of violence and domestic violence. So I'm interested to look at, you know, that kind of intersection. But also quite a few of the poems in the collection are looking at horses. I'm really interested in my horse riding background. So I grew up on a farm and I learned a lot about horses when I was growing up. Even though we were a poor family, I did a lot of manual labor when I grew up and spent a lot of time with horses. So I'm really interested in how horses themselves can reflect these ideas of strength and vulnerability. And then when I moved to Wales, I became really fascinated with the Gower. That's where my husband is from. And it's so beautiful there. And the wild horses and wild ponies are incredible. So quite a lot of the year I spent on my Literature Wales bursary was researching and tracking those horses in the Gower and learning about them and reading letters from the public about them, and it's really fascinating. So this collection is exploring these kind of themes. It's still emerging, so I don't really know where it's going to go, but this is the beginning. It's the starting point, and I'm really enjoying spending some time thinking about these ideas and writing poems on these themes. So hopefully we'll see what happens, but it's been a nice thing to have as a project to kind of return to during the lockdown. So yeah, I've been really enjoying that.